Hello and welcome back. It's always nice to see you all as we continue our series on the saints. Today I would like to say a few words about St. Lucy. Now, St. Lucy is the patron saint of people with blindness or other eye disorders. And she was an ancient saint, dying probably in the year 304 or 305. She isn't somebody we really know all that much about. There are some legends, and I'll tell you a little bit of that today. But she's somebody who, when I was walking through St. Bartholomew's Church, I saw her statue and I said, we ought to talk a little bit about Lucy. So she's not just the patron saint of people with eye disorders, but she's also somebody who inspires us even when our eyes are in the best of health or condition. So anyway, today, I'd like to tell you about the world she lived in. Now, the emperor at the time was Diocletian. Diocletian became the emperor of Rome in the 380s. And Rome had been through a period of decline, so Diocletian was one of these people who said, well, we want to recapture the former glory. We want to recapture Rome's former greatness. We have to get back to the way things were and make things great again. And that's how he felt. And he looked around and asked, what has changed? And one of the things that had changed in the Roman Empire was more and more people were embracing Christianity. And he thought that was a problem. In part because in embracing Christianity, they were turning their back on, the old Roman gods. But more importantly, they were turning their back on the idea that the emperor himself was divine. And so he saw it as a sign of decay and a sign of corruption, and, he saw them as undermining the strength of the empire. So he did what he could to stamp out the faith. First, he expelled all Christians from serving in the army. And then he expelled all Christians from serving in his government. And then he made all sorts of laws outlawing the clergy and telling Christians that they had to sacrifice to the Roman gods in general and sacrifice for the emperor in particular. And that's where things got to be pretty rough, because Christians couldn't do those things in good conscience. And so many of them had to move underground. They had to hide their faith. They had to celebrate Mass in odd locations because they didn't want to be arrested by the authorities and maybe tortured, maybe killed. Now, Saint Lucy grew up in that world. And she was born into a wealthy family in Sicily. Her father died when she was 5, but she and her mother survived reasonably well. She knew about the persecution, and she was living in the time of the persecution. And so one of the things she did was she would take food to those Christians who were hiding down in the catacombs. Now, Lucy's name means light, but one of the things she did was she wanted to carry more food, so she would put a wreath on her head with candles on the wreath, kind of like a coal miner would wear in those days, to light the way so she could use both hands to carry the bread that she was carrying for those Christians who were in need. And so the light sort of became a symbol of who she was and what her ministry was about. The problem arose when she was promised in marriage to a young man, and she had to refuse. Her mother was a very sickly woman, and Lucy prayed and prayed and prayed for her mother. One day she went to a shrine, the shrine of St. Agatha, and she was praying for her mother's health, and she was promised that her mother would get better, but she promised herself, because of that, and she would devote her life to Christ and devote her life or herself to a life of perpetual virginity for the sake of the kingdom. And that's what she did. So the suitor, the young man who wanted to marry her, was rather disappointed. And a promise had been made, so he wasn't just disappointed, he was angry. And so he turned this Christian girl over to the authorities. And that's how her life came to an end. Now, the legendary parts of the story take up there. She was sentenced to be thrown into a brothel But supposedly, when the soldiers tried to drag her off, she was fixed to the floor and she couldn't be moved. And they even attached a team of oxen to her, but still she couldn't be moved. They tried to burn her on the spot, but the wood wouldn't burn. She was telling the prefect that his days were numbered and the day would come soon that all of this would be made right, and he had her eyes put out. That's how she became the patron of people with eye troubles. Finally, she was stabbed with a sword and died. That's the story of St. Lucy. There are two accounts of how her eyes were put out. One was that the Romans did it. The other one, which I don't really like too much, is that she was so tired of people admiring the beauty of her eyes that she gouged them out herself, which I think is a pretty horrible thing, and I don't think God wants us to maim ourselves, so I like the other version better. But what impresses me about Lucy, and what impresses me about saints like her, and there are many, there's St. Agatha, there's St. Barbara, there's St. Catherine, there's St. Agnes. They were these early Christian martyrs who were generally girls or very young women who were taken before the authorities, subjected to terrible tortures, and they remained stalwart. They didn't care what the Romans did to them, but they kept preaching. They kept speaking about their faith. They would not be moved. And people looked at their example as the years went by and asked, what is giving them this great strength? And the answer was their relationship with God, their relationship with Jesus Christ, their desire to follow in his footsteps as well as they could. And so they did, and they inspired even their persecutors. Now, one of the things about St. Lucy that is really great is, her name means light, and she lived in a time that, in a sense, was the darkness before the dawn. 10, 12 years later, the Emperor Constantine would make Christianity legal, and it soon became the official faith of the empire. So she lived in those last, worst days of persecution. In doing so, she gave her life, but she gave her life because she knew it was right, and in doing so, she inspired so many millions of people down through the ages. So her feast day is December 13th. If you have eye problems yourself, or you know somebody who does, a prayer to St. Lucy asking her for her intercession is a wonderfully good idea. And even if you don't think about her in those terms, think about the example of a courageous young woman who stood up to the authorities in the name of what was right. Thank you.